there, Porsche fans. Just got done putting another engine into the Maestro's engine database. I'm the Maestro's assistant. He's off on vacation right now. And while he's gone, we're going to do something for you that he may not like. We're going to do it anyhow. If you've read the Maestro's books, the ABCs and 912s of Porsche engines, Secrets of the Inner Circle, Murphy is my co-pilot, Maestro Chronicles, or the Maestro Spec book, you know how much money they can save you and how you can do a complete engine overhaul on your 356 or 912 Porsche the right way the first time. While he's on vacation, we're going to take you out in the studio and do a complete engine overhaul for you, so you can see how it's done before your very eyes. We'll take a 1962 356B engine with over 100,000 miles on it. We'll tear it apart, take it completely down, take the parts to the machine shop, the powder painters, the CAD platers, etc. We'll bring it all back together again. We'll assemble it completely in front of you, and we'll even fire it up. So let's sneak that in while he's gone, and come with us now to the studio, and we'll take it away. Good evening, old Porsche fans. Today we're going to do something that's never been done before in recorded human history. We're going to show you a videotape of how to do a 356 or 912 engine overhaul, complete from taking it apart, inspecting all the parts, what to do in the machine shop, and how to put it back together again, even how to fire it up here on this very own engine stand. As we go along, we'll describe defects in the engine, then what things are good, bad, indifferent, etc. And with that, you should be able to save thousands of dollars on doing an engine overhaul yourself, which in this day and age is something you probably ought to do yourself anyhow, since the local super-duper Porsche shop usually has the best mechanics work on the Arab's 928, or the doctors or lawyers 911 or 930 or whatever, and you get the Volkswagen apprentice to work on your 356. And that usually, in that case, the engine is older than he is. So you're usually better off doing it yourself anyhow. And this videotape is going to show you how to do that. Here we have a 1962, circa, 356B 1600 super engine. This will suffice for about 80% of all the engines out there, and for the ones that it won't suffice with, we can point out the differences. Based upon this engine number, 703105, and a case casting number, which is a very important ID number, is back here by the fan shroud on top of a perimeter bolt, right there, which is 58046 in this case. And the Maestro Master database of over 2,000 engine numbers is available in the new version of Secrets of the Inner Circle, or in the Maestro Spec book. We can tell this engine is a early to mid 1962 356B 1600 Super. Let me point out a few things about this engine, because this is pretty typical of what you see these days, these being 25 years old. Note the red paint on the nut, the red paint here on the side of the oil breather can, and on, in fact, the top of the air filters. This overspray from where the outside of the car was painted red. When people paint the outside of the car, they very seldom cover the engine to any great degree. Net effect being that overspray from the outside body color gets transmitted to the outside of the engine also, all over things that were never supposed to be painted in the first place. Net effect of this is to make an ugly engine. This is also a fairly ugly engine, just in the amount of grease and crud and everything on it, which is typical for its age. It's a typical run-of-the-mill, 100,000-mile-old 356B Porsche engine. But let me point a few more things out that are interesting. This coil wire is actually the original coil wire. It's got about a 1-inch long rubber cup, and that's a mark of the original type wire. They have a resistor inside this, which is why it's longer. This is a replacement wire, probably a VW. In fact, when I point out a few other things, you'll find it is a VW. It's got a Volkswagen coil on it, because the Porsche coils had a screw-on connection, not just a clip-on type. It has a muffler that's typical for the Genera, meaning it's wiped out, shot, no good. We'll just throw it away and put a new muffler on it. I like stock mufflers over anything else, because stock mufflers last a long time and run very quietly. We have an original fuel pump. We have an original fuel line with the flexible connection in between there. And here, for example, is one of the VW plug wires with no rubber skirt on it, small connector. This is a Porsche plug wire with a bona fide skirt, a bona fide Porsche end on it. Much better than the VW, easier to grab with a little knob. You can see this engine's been through the mill. Some original parts, some not original parts. What we'll do is we're going to take this engine apart and then put it back together again for you. And you can use this videotape to rebuild your own engine. If you have any questions that aren't answered by the videotape, try Secrets of the Inner Circle, a production of HCP Research, 20655 Sunrise Drive in Cupertino, 95014. The new version is just out now in mid-September 1986, and it costs $29.95 list price. If you buy the videotape, we'll give it to you for $24.95. Now, isn't that a deal? I guess that's all we can do right now, except I haven't the foggiest idea what's inside this engine. In fact, it's been overhauled. It can be told by one of two things. One, there are 11 nuts, 8mm nuts, that hold the third piece on to the main case halves. And these are normally, and supposed to be, 12mm across the flat. That means a 12mm wrench will take them off. In this case, these are 13mm across the flat, I've already checked, which means the third piece's nuts have been removed, which means the third piece has been removed, which usually means the engine has been overhauled. And because the nuts are not the right ones for the case usually takes when the factory put them together, the odds are very high the overhaul was not done too well because the detail work was not done too well. You can usually tell a lot from the outside of the engine what the inside of the engine is going to be like. Not all the time, but sometimes. Likewise, over here, we have a 6mm cheesehead screw. Now, it's kind of a rule of thumb on early Porsches and Porsche engines up to 1969-912 that the vertical surface, any vertical surface that has a bolt or screw through it actually has a 6mm bolt, which has a hex head. It's 10mm across the flat, so a 10mm wrench takes it off. In this situation, we have a 6mm cheesehead screw, which is the wrong screw for the vertical surface. The 6mm cheesehead screws go on the horizontal surfaces in general, and consequently this indicates that somebody has removed the 6mm bolt, replaced it with a 6mm cheesehead screw, again not the right one, and that the fan shroud has been removed, which is not that unusual if this thing had been overhauled, because you would have to remove the fan shroud to get to anything else. Ergo, the outside evidence is this engine has been overhauled at some time in the past. Note from the condition of the fan shroud, where you can still see the remains of the valve adjust decal, that this appears to be an original fan shroud. It has not been repainted or anything like that. So when they overhauled it before, they just took the sheet metal off, then put it back together again. We are going to strip everything here chemically of rust, grease, and paint. We're going to powder paint all the sheet metal. We're going to CAD plate all the nuts and bolts on the engine. We're going to make it look very close to the poster engine. We will not gold plate it this time. We'll just do the things as a typical overhaul should be done and show you how to do them. Notice also that we should not necessarily want to wear your Brooks Brothers Finest or a white suit when you're doing the engine overhaul, because it does get a little bit messy. So if you pardon us now, we'll change into something a little more expendable. Old clothes, t-shirt, sweatshirt, blue jeans, etc. Overhaul outfit is the proper attire for doing an engine overhaul of this nature. Something, if you get it dirty or if something spills on you don't like, you can not have to worry about replacing $300 suits. So let me change my clothes. We'll come back here and do a complete overhaul, tear it down, see what's inside. Like I said, I haven't the foggiest idea what's inside. We'll find out what's inside, and we'll show you how to take it down and how to put it back together again, and what to do to it when it's down. Okay, 356 fans, now that we've changed into something more comfortable, we can start the disassembly of this. It doesn't make too much difference where you begin here, but I like to begin from the top and work my way down. The first thing to do is to remove the air cleaners. On the Zeniths, they're held on by a screw combination bolt you can never get a socket wrench or a regular wrench in on, and the screw is usually too tight, but occasionally you can just wiggle and pull, and off come the air cleaners. Pop up the clips to hold them together, like so. Take off the top, put the top in the to-be stripped and then to-be powder painted box, like yay. Take the air cleaner element, inspect it. It's not too bad, but we're going to put Weber's on, so we don't need it anyhow. Put that in the box that stays here. If there is a rubber gasket, which in this case there isn't, take that out too. And with nothing else left inside, put that in the to-be stripped and painted box. Likewise, go to the other one. It comes right off too. Again, take the snaps off, take the top off, put that in the to-be plated, to-be painted box. Air cleaner cans are not too bad. Likewise, is missing gasket inside. Should be a nice rubber gasket that fits around this hole to seal everything and hold the air cleaner tight, but there's not in this case. Another example of the guy before you. That goes to be stripped. And now we have the engine fairly naked. Another trick I'm going to show you here disconnect the linkage. Now you can pull on these things and maybe they'll come apart and maybe they won't, but what's easier is take a 10mm wrench, open end, stick it in between here, twist like that, and off it comes. Likewise down here, like so. This is going to be stripped and plated, so we put this in the stripped and plated box, like yay. Go around to the other one, take that one off. It's very easy when you know how, isn't it? And there's one in the front of the fan shroud, done the same way. It's for the bell crank lever. Take that off and put that in the to be stripped and plated box. I guess the next thing we should do here is take off the fuel line, and we'll take the carburetors off, take the sheet metal off, lift the fan housing off, and go from there. The muffler is almost always the worst part because they're rusted permanently underneath here where the muffler pipe joins the J-tube. And I'll explain that a little further when we get to it. I may as well take the dipstick out now. Check to see if there's oil in the engine. Yes, there is, so I have to drain the oil. Put that in the to-be-plated box. Now let's take the fuel line off. On Zenith, a 17mm across the flat wrench will take off this, and we happen to have one here. Open end. Unscrew it. Take it out. Note the crud and corrosion on it and everything else, which means the carburetors have a lot of crud inside. Another good reason for changing over to Webers. Put that to be plated. Go around to the other side with the same wrench. And take this one off. Again, oh, here's something interesting. I don't know if you can see that, but the top of the Zenith carburetor is moving while the base is remaining intact. Another reason what has happened is there's 4 screws that go from the cast iron base into the pot metal body, and they've obviously loosened up, allowing the body to twist on its screws there and also cause gross leaks, gasoline leaks, which can lead to fires and other disasters. Oh my word. Look at the rust and crud inside there. We have a real mess inside that Zenith carburetor, but that's okay, they're going to leave. On the B-type fuel pump, the fuel line inlet, outlet to the carburetors is held on by another 17mm across the flat hollow bolt. In fact, this particular one, will have, when we get it off, a different thread than the other two. And these are marked by a V on that side there. You cannot screw it into the Zenith carburetor connection. They only go on the fuel pump. We're going to replace this pump with a C-type, C912 type pump. And look at the crud in that. Boy, what a mess that is. Good thing we're doing an overhaul on this. Fuel line's now off except for one attachment here on the front of the fan housing. We'll take that off so we can put the fuel line and everything connected to it in the to-be-plated box. Okay. This is a very important clamp. You should take it off so it can be plated separately. This connection here used to be a flexible connection like this here, but it's long since leaked. These always do leak after 100,000 miles. Simple fix here is just fuel line with clamps. We remove these clamps and plate all parts of the fuel line. Put that in the box for the time being. Now let's take the carburetors off. The correct size for the nuts on Zenith carburetor is an 8mm, 12mm across the flat. And lo and behold, these are. It makes life a lot easier taking off 8mm, 12mm across the flat 8mm nuts than it does to take off 13 or 14. Also note, when you're taking this nut off here, don't go too far or you can bend and render useless the accelerator pump link. So be careful when you're removing these things, and you'll find that if you are careful, you'll be rewarded by not having to ruin things that otherwise should not be ruined. There are 4 nuts. The second one likewise, you have to watch that you don't go too far and break off the idle mixture screw. That's happened several times. The Bespeckled Beckel has a story about that he would be happy to tell you someday, about how on a trip his son had tightened down the Zenith carburetor just before they went on the trip, and about 50 miles later, going over Pacheco Pass, they had a slight problem with the carburetor because a needle valve had broken off. Very difficult to adjust at that point. Save the nuts and washers and put them in the to-be-plated box. This one here is sometimes more difficult to get to. You occasionally have to use little bit more, 2 more wrenches to get to it occasionally. And occasionally it's extremely difficult to get to. But we'll usually get it one way or the other, like so. Sometimes you have to use the open end of the wrench because you can't get in there with the box end. Box end, the better way to fly, but if you can't get in with the box end, it's not very good. So, we got one more nut to go after this one. Incidentally, if you look down the Zenith carburetor, you can see a couple of things. One is the air correction jets. They are the big 1/4 inch outside diameter brass fittings that'll have numbers on top of them. In this particular case, we can barely read them, but they read 220, which is what they should be for Zenith type carburetors of the super vintage. Normals have 230 air correction jets, and C's have 210. This is the last nut on the Zenith carburetor, and once we get this off, we can then take the carburetor off and see if any screws fall out, which occasionally do. And since this is loose, we have a good chance we might see some screws falling off. Give it a little whack, give it another little whack, and off it comes. And these are the screws here, 4 of them, that hold the base, the rest of the carburetor, and they are a little bit loose. We'll put this in the to be kept box. You don't do anything with it unless you want to overhaul it. Put the nuts in the to be plated box and tackle this Zenith carburetor. Again, it helps to have an assortment of wrenches because sometimes you can't get into the area with your favorite wrench. Let's take off one of these first. There we go. Check again the size of the air corrections, make sure both carburetors are the same. You can also, with a good light, look down the carburetor venturi and there'll be a number, 32, well 28 or 24, cast into the venturi. And this number is in fact the venturi size in millimeters. And the normal Zenith carburetors have a 24 millimeter venturi, and the Super Zeniths have a 28 millimeter venturi. And these have 28, inferring they're super carbs. And in fact, which they should be, since this is a super engine, they should have super carbs, and apparently they do. Now later on, if we get really ambitious, we can take the top off the carburetor. From the evidence of the crud on the bolts entering the carburetor and the fuel pump, there is an awful lot of crud inside these carburetors. And the general reason for that is corrosion of the gas tank. This was an East Coast car this engine came out of. East Coast cars get a lot of condensation in the gas tank, a lot of rust in the gas tank, and the fuel filters inside the fuel line and the fuel cock of the 356 Porsche are not terribly good. Net effect being they let the crud pass right to the carburetors. It'll fill up the float bowl, clog your jets, and generally make a mess of things. Now this little lovely here, best way of getting that off of the open end without ruining things is to take out the idle mixture screw so you don't break it off. Set that aside, put the wrench on, and watch it not come off. So let's try it on this side, and like yay, and we get it. Some nuts, especially 6 millimeter cheesehead screws, you may have to use an impact wrench, available at Sears for about 10 bucks. And that's about the only way to get some of the nuts out. The other choice is a giant screwdriver. Don't hesitate to buy them. They could save your life. Okay, so we have everything off here. Let's put the needle idle mixture screw back in. Like so. Give a little whack. And away we go. One more Zenith carburetor is off. Put that in the to be kept box. The manifold gasket is basically garbage. We can throw it away later. And now we're down to this position. And we want to take the fan shroud off basically first. Next step should be taking off the fan belt. To do that, it helps to have a 36 millimeter socket, which you need anyhow for the flywheel nut. You simply place it on like so, get out a screwdriver, crank the pulley around to where you can put the screwdriver in, wedged against a nut inside the housing of the generator, and usually the nut will come off. Usually. If it doesn't come off, you can cut the fan belt and take this whole assembly down to your local machine shop that has an impact wrench to remove it that way, so you can always get it off. You have to take the fan belt off though to get the fan shroud off to continue the engine disassembly. Take off everything here. The fan belt can be used for a spare if it's still good, but we'll put a new one on it. Take off all the washers, put them in a to-be-plated box. See if the generator spins, which it does. Wonderful, it's in pretty good shape. Next step would be to remove the wire on the coil, both the primary wire and the secondary. May as well take off the fitting also. Put that in the to-be-kept box, so we'll put new wires on it. Now you should open, or at least loosen the nut on the oil filter can, because it's sometimes very tight, and you use your universal metric wrench for that. This one wasn't very tight, but what the heck. Good idea at this point to take it off and look at the top of the oil filter. Because the top of the oil filter acts like a gold miner's pan, and any particles that come in the engine eventually can end up on top of the filter. If you see a lot of little particles, either bronze colored, copper colored, or aluminum colored, that's pieces of bearing, or in some cases case. All we see here is basically crud, which is good. That means that generally the engine may be in pretty good shape inside. Put that back loosely for the time being. Get about 12 millimeter across the flat wrench and disconnect the oil lines to and from the filter. Yeah, unscrew them a little bit, break it loose. Take it off, wiggle it back and forth, and it pops out. Likewise down here. You can unscrew it like yay. Get it unscrewed completely. Wiggle it back and forth, and it comes off. Okay, next thing holding the fan shroud down to the engine is a strap here. This strap ties the generator down to the generator stand, and the strap nut should be a 14 millimeter across the flat nut on 356s and a 13 millimeter across the flat on 912s, and lo and behold, it's 14. We win. You loosen it up until it's pretty loose. In fact, we have to take it all the way off, but it gets plated or painted too. Original engines were, of course, plated here on this strap, but I find if you're doing a powder paint overhaul, powder painted engine, which of course all the Maestro's engines are, then it sometimes looks nice to powder paint it, though the customer is always right when it comes to the painting or plating of the bands and straps. Whatever they want, we are more than happy to accommodate. Take it all the way out. Take the band off. I like to screw the nut back in so you keep it. This is incidentally is a somewhat special bolt. It's a little longer than any other bolt. It's similar to the bolts to hold down the engine stand or the generator stand here, but it's a little bit longer. So try and keep the bolt separate where you know where it is. Put it in a to-be-plated or painted box. Next step is this thing here is a thermostat rod. It goes down to the rear plate, which has a flapper valve. It controls how hot air is ducted to the carburetors. It just unscrews. You grab a hold of the little thermostat in the front. Actually helps to tighten the nut down a bit. If you're really lucky, you can unscrew it. If you're not really lucky, you'll have to use a wrench on it. Yes, we're not really lucky. So what we can do is get a pair of pliers out, or a universal wrench will sometimes work too. Like about yay. That is going to be a tough one. I can see that coming. That is a tough one. We may have to deal with this a little later. There we go. There, once you break it loose, it's not too bad. Considering the fact it's got 20 years or more of accumulated rust, the fact it broke loose relatively easily is really a pretty good sign. While you're here, there's a 14 millimeter across the flat nut bolt actually that holds the thermostat on in the back. Just loosen it and then you get the thermostat out. What you really want to do, you do not plate the thermostat. It's copper. You just clean it and reuse it. Put the bolt in the to-be plated box. And now, next step is to take out the screws that hold the sheet metal to the fan housing. And we lift up the whole assembly and go from there. So let us first, now normally these screws here are 6mm bolts. But somebody's been here before us and they're 6mm cheesehead screws now. So you simply put a screwdriver in there, and if you're lucky, we are, it actually will turn, loosen, and come out. Like so. Now most of these 6mm screws are cheap and can be replaced with new ones, which is a good thing to do. Buy a few hundred of them. They'll come in handy for all kinds of things. Likewise, this one here is a screw, but it does come out without too much effort. And there's likewise screws on the opposite side of the engine. In fact, one is missing here, making our job all the more easy. Take that out. Now about the only thing that's left are these screws, these bolts here. In fact, they should be 6mm bolts with a screwdriver slot in them, but they're not because somebody else has been here before us. So you take them out with a 10mm across the flat wrench, like a. I'd say, judging from condition of this engine, the last overhaul was performed somewhere in the distant past, probably 10 years ago or so. Take that one out. Take the other one out here. And while you're actually over on this side, you may as well take out the 3 6mm bolts that hold the spring plate that holds the top linkage crossbar, because all those have to be removed. We're going to plate everything there. Take out the 6mm bolt there, put it in the to-be plated box. Take these 3 out, and then both the spring plate and the top linkage crossbar will come off. Note that this is a messy operation. You're going to get dirty. It's a good idea to wear gloves, but if you want to feel your engine, it helps not to wear them so you can sense what's happening to your poor little engine there. It also makes it easier for gripping things. Surgical gloves are a very good idea. So your doctors in the audience already have a good access to surgical gloves. I suggest that you pick up a good dozen or so and from the hospital and bring them back to your engine. Okay, now if we got everything else off, and in late 912s there is another bolt right here that holds the top mount of the oil cooler to the fan housing. 356s don't have that unless the engine has been overhauled by the factory after 1967. This one was overhauled by somebody other than the factory. So you grab it by the fan shroud here and the generator here, wiggle a little bit, pull up, and lo and behold, everything comes off. We'll strip this down a little later, just a bunch of nuts and bolts holding everything on. For the time being, we'll put it in the to-be plated painted box. And now we have part of the engine exposed. This, of course, is the oil cooler. From the shape of it, little dimples and all, it's an early oil cooler. In fact, there is a date stamp on it, which in this case says fiscal week 17, 1963. There's usually another date stamp down below here, but I don't see that. It's too cruddy right now. This cooler should probably be replaced with a later model cooler. It's not a bad one. It does have a wire mesh inside the blades, but it's fairly early. The later coolers are better, and you're better off replacing it. We don't have to take it off right now. Let's continue with the sheet metal. Let's take the oil breather can off. To do that, you first open the hood, get a screwdriver or something, and take out the rubber gasket. You don't want to lose that. It's hard to find. And here's another trick. When you go to put it back together again, note how this side is all fairly rotten. Just turn it over. And the other side is in pretty good shape and will seal nicely. Then you get more use out of it, but Stoddard has these new for, I don't know, $5, $6, a fairly good investment. Keep that. Now, the oil breather can is held to the generator stand by, again, 2 6mm bolts and nuts, which are 10mm across the flat. And note that there is a washer underneath both the bolt head and the nut. It's one of the few combinations that have washers on both sides, but for this particular application it does. Remember that when you go to put it back together again, that in fact these bolts have washers both underneath the bolt head and underneath the nut. Now when we get this off, I'll show you a place where they crack and fail the most. It's where you might expect it would be, either where water sits inside the can, either the top here or the side, or down where this tube joins the bottom. And we'll inspect that once we get this off. Sometimes you need 2 wrenches. They're a little bit tight and the bolts tend to rotate, but in this case we can hold it with our fingers. Take the other one out, put it in a to be plated box, take this up, inspect this area here, either where the throat joins the body here or where the tube here joins the body there. And we're really lucky. There seem to be no cracks. If you have a strange oil leak that drools down here, this is usually the cause. A leak either on the throat or the breather tube where it joins the body of the can. In this case, it's not too bad. Put that in the to be stripped and painted box. Now let's get the distributor taken care of before it gets hurt by anything. You can either leave it all together and just pull off the wires with everything all connected, which is probably the best thing to do anyhow, like yay. And then, because we want to plate the clip, the clamp that holds the distributor, the best thing to do is just loosen this up so the distributor can be then pulled up independent of the clamp, like yay, wiggle and pull, and put this carefully in the box that you're keeping here, because this doesn't get plated or painted or anything. Okay, and now you're beginning to see it's coming down. We've been avoiding the muffler for a long time. I suppose next step should be dealing with the muffler. Generally, these are supposed to be 8mm nuts with 12mm across the flats, but be prepared for anything here, either 13 or 14, which makes life really difficult getting a wrench on. In this case, we're really lucky because it is a 12mm across the flat nut. And though you can use a ratchet, I like to feel a wrench better. It's a little slower, but you get to know your engine more. It feels a bit more intimate. This guy even put a washer on the nut, and in fact, they don't have washers originally, believe it or not, on the exhaust system like that. And that's a 12mm down there, 12mm across the flat. And it's actually coming loose pretty well. Liquid wrench, or a WD-40, is pretty good to use on any nut or bolt that is too tight to turn instantly. Spray it on, let it sit for about 20 minutes or so, go off and do something else, and come back, and then usually it will loosen the bolt up. In case it doesn't, you can use the impact screwdriver technique on screwdrivers. If you have an impact wrench with air, that's wonderful, but most people don't. The other choice, of course, is a chisel, hammer and chisel, where you take the chisel and apply it to the hex of the nut in such a way as to loosen it. And if you do it properly, you will get it off without damage to the stud. The nut's expendable. And this one here is actually loosening up. Boy, we're pretty lucky today here. Sometimes the studs will come out along with the nut. In that case, VW studs are basically the same as Porsche. There are some differences, but they do work. The exhaust manifold studs. And you go down to your local VW shop and get some new studs. Put them in with a double nut technique, whereby you tighten 2 nuts against each other on the stud, and then screw the stud in by using the outer nut, tighten it, loosen the nuts once everything's tight, once the stud is in place, and undo the nuts, leaving the stud in the head. Now the worst part about these mufflers is that they come off the flange here quite easily. But down below, in this connection here where the muffler pipe goes over or into the J-tube, they rust together after a very short time. And after 10 or 15 years, they become an intimate part of each other. Sometimes you just can't get them off. Sometimes you have to cut the muffler off the pipe and then use a chisel to tear away at the outer pipe from the muffler to save the J-tube. You do not want to cut into the J-tube. J-tubes are extremely hard to find in good shape, and you're much better off just cutting the muffler off and sacrificing it than you are trying to cut the J-tube off and repair it. So we'll see how lucky we get here when we go down to that point. These are the muffler clamps down here. I've already gone a little ahead of us and loosened these. Let's see, they were 13 millimeter across the flat. And there's 13 there. We take these off completely, or we loosen them up sufficiently to where the clamp will move. And the best thing to do at that point is take a hammer, your choice of hammer, a claw hammer works okay, and pound it forward till it's off the pipe completely, like so. Move it way to the front, get it out of your way. And now this serrated edge here, where the muffler fits over the J-tube, is the problem area. And what you can do if all else fails is take a chisel and carefully wang the chisel in here, expanding these metal flutes like a banana, like you would peel a banana. In fact, if you have to, you can just use the chisel as a cutting device to cut all the way down here. And then with spraying WD-40 or liquid wrench in, as you're pounding with all the other nuts off, the muffler will eventually come loose. Either that or cut the muffler off just about here, and then you can take the other pipe down to the machine shop, or when you have it loose you can have much more access to it and get it off eventually. But don't cut the J-tube because they're extremely hard to get, especially in halfway decent shape. And try, if you can, to loosen it at the connection by getting either a small screwdriver in there or a chisel. Let's go over the other side here and remove the other bolt that holds the clamp, the rusted connection. And this has already been loosened a little bit, so we cheated a little bit on you, but you get the idea. Move the clamp back. Okay, get it out of the way. And now the fun begins. If you're going to save your muffler, or try and save your muffler, the best thing to do is try hitting it on the inside with a piece of wood up against it. Bigger piece of wood, the better. Alternate from side to side, so that you try and get one side off and then the other side. If you don't care about the muffler, you can hit directly on it and take out a lot of your frustrations at the same time. In this particular situation, we'll take out our frustrations. And look at that, will you? How about that, fans? It actually does come loose. Like yay. Get it all the way off, like so. And you can wiggle it back and forth. Maybe another little love tap or two on this side. And lo and behold, off we go. This goes into the junk box to be thrown away and never seen again. Set it down over there. And now we come to where we can strip the sheet metal off pretty effectively, except for the always tight nut or bolt or screw or washer type of thing here. Clean off everything. Now's a good time too to take out all the rubber that's on all the sheet metal, because you want to strip everything. When you strip the groove area, want to paint the groove area so that new rubber can be put in easily without great trauma. This is garbage also. Toss that away. This one here may be fun. It's in pretty rotten shape. If we're really lucky and really careful, we can just pull it off like yay, haha. Throw that away, that's garbage. Get your big screwdriver out. Proceed to take out every screw you can find, both in the front here. There are 3 that hold the fuel pump shroud, the heater box, and the cylinder shroud together. Take all 3 of them out all the way. The bigger the screwdriver you have for this operation, the better. Like I say, if you reach a stage where one screw is just too tight to come out, an impact wrench from Sears is a wonderful investment. It is sometimes the only way to fly, except for a chisel, to either break them loose or break them off. Take the screws out completely. There are 2 screws to screw the side horizontal plates with the rubber into the head. And incidentally, if you have an oil leak in the front of your engine, either left or right hand side, you might want to check and see if these screws in particular are in place. This one here and one symmetrically located to the front of the engine. The reason for that is they go straight through into the head, in the rocker box area of the head. If they come out, there's a hole open between the rocker box area of the head in the outside world. And oil will be blown up from that hole and get all in your sheet metal and cause a very difficult to find oil leak. It'll drive you nuts trying to find it. Take the other one out here. The number 3 cylinder shroud only has one screw holding it in place, like yay. It is usually more efficient, well, we can take this off since we got it off. Put that in the to-be stripped and painted box. Usually more efficient to go around with the screwdriver to all the screws first before you pull everything up. But if you can't wait, you have my permission to just pull it up now. Like, yeah, you take them all out. This dipstick shroud is actually, I'm actually amazed it's installed here, because usually on an overhaul it's not done by anyone who is concerned about their engine. This piece is easily lost, forgotten, or left out. And when it's left out, it looks ugly, for one thing, and it actually causes the engine to overheat somewhat, because all the sheet metal should be in place and intact when you're doing an engine overhaul, because these are air-cooled engines. And now we have a real goodie here. The first thing we do is tighten down the engine stand so it can't go anywhere. Looks like it's cross-threaded. And find that we have a real goodie. We'll come back to him, and I'll even get out the impact and show you how the impact works, though it's not too terribly difficult to figure out. Get out all these. We'll take everything off we can. At this point, too, we should remove the fuel pump, since it's going to be in the way anyhow, and it has to come off at some point. So we'll remove the whole thing. You can take just the line off, which we may as well do anyhow. The 17 millimeter wrench needed for this part of the line, and a 13 millimeter, 13 or 14. Get both out to be sure. This is a little tricky. You should hold that part of the wrench, or that part of the nut, as you loosen up this part, like yay. Otherwise, you can strip either the connection in here on the block or the connection there on the fuel pump. So loosen it up, like so. And this line should also be plated too, so we'll put that in the to-be plated box. Tight to the last thread. Some of these things are always tight to the last thread. Like yay, to be plated. Now for the fuel pump, since this is a 356, you have to take out the fan shroud. And then we may as well take these pieces off now. Show you how they come off. You have to wiggle them around the pump a little. That should pop up like yay. Just comes off like yay. They all get stripped and painted. Fuel pump, 14 millimeter nuts, or actually bolts. Loosen one up, go to the other side, and I see he's put a 13 millimeter in there. Wonderful. Like I say, when you're dealing with an engine overhaul, been done before, you have to be prepared for almost anything. And in this case, one was one 13 millimeter bolt, one 14. The factory would never do anything like that, but you'd be surprised at how many other guys who overhaul engines don't care about the size of the nuts and bolts. Or washers. In fact, even the washers have a unique setting arrangement throughout the engine. This is a B-type pump. Excuse me. It's you can see the crud inside from the fuel tank. That's rust in the fuel tank, etc. Lots of grease in here to lubricate the mechanism. A lot of monkey motion. I don't like B-type pumps, and they're hard to find new anyhow anymore. 1986. I replaced the whole assembly with a C912 pump that works just really nicely for 100,000 miles and looks better. So we keep this, put the bolts in the to-be plated box. Okay, and we'll deal with that screw later, but meanwhile this is number 3 4-side cylinders. Incidentally, the cylinders are of course numbered. The right front is number 1, the right rear is number 2, the left front's number 3, and the left rear is number 4. We'll take this head off and everything off this side, and then show you that side if we find anything unusual. So next step now is remove the J-tube and heater box assembly. That's held on here normally by a 12 millimeter across the flat nut, but in this case it's 13 because somebody has been there before us. The bottom one is likewise a 13, but it's actually fairly loose, so we can get it out without a lot of swearing. Now's a good time to check out the cylinder fins and look for any mouse nests, rat nests, bee nests, or anything else that might have taken up habitation in your engine. Check out any cylinder fins that are broken. These fins look pretty much intact. Check out any evidence of leakage from carbon forming. Don't see any there either. We may be in luck. This actually might be a halfway decent engine. The chances of getting a halfway decent engine are something on the order of 50-50. Half of them are actually pretty good, considering their age, and the other half have been butchered by turkeys who just don't want to know, or just don't know how to do the job right, or don't care, or both. Take out the second nut here on the J-tube, and you can then take the J-tube and heater box assembly off as a unit, where they can be plated or painted as a unit. Move it straight down. This is a double flapper heater box, which it should be. Supers of this vintage, Supers, Super 90s, All Cs and SCs, have two flappers, one here and one here. They tend to exhaust the air more straight downwards, and they make for better cooling of the engine. So they are better, and this is bona fide the original. Take off the clamp to be plated, put this in the to be painted box. Put the nuts in the to be painted box. Now before I can remove the head, we have to take off the manifold. Before we can do that, you have to take out the spark plugs. So you get out your standard spark plug wrench and socket wrench. As far as tools go, Craftsman from Sears is pretty good. I kind of like it. Snap-on makes excellent tools. They're pretty high priced, but they are good tools. Stay away from the El Cheapo Indian, Taiwanese, etc. They're not very good. This is a Bosch 225 T1 non-extended tip spark plug. Not too bad. You can tell a lot of the condition of the engine by what the plugs look like. In this case, it has carbon on it, but it's not fouled badly. It's actually in fairly decent shape, so maybe the engine inside will be. Number 3 is always the cylinder that suffers the most. It runs the hottest, gets the poorest cooling, has the most trouble with poor gas, which we now have throughout the country. But in this case, the plug actually looks about like the number 4 plug did, and not too bad. We'll save them, put them in the same order you took them off at. And now we'll get down to taking off the manifold. Generally, you'll find that this bolt on the 356 is a 14 millimeter across the flat. These nuts are usually 12, but can be anything if somebody else has been there before us. So be prepared with 12, 13, or 14 millimeter sockets to get everything off. That is indeed a 14. Take it out. This is a special bolt too. You might want to label it. Its length is about the same as the perimeter bolts here on the case, but a little bit longer. And if you use a perimeter bolt in here, it's not long enough and tends to strip out the hole. So you got to be careful when you do all this, so you put the right bolts back in the right place so you can end up with problems that you don't want to have. Take it off, see what this one is. Boy, is this a 14? No, I can't believe that. 13. Put that in the to be plated box. Get out your 13 millimeter socket. Okay. Now you can use air if you want to here, but like I say, then you can't say your engine's been hand assembled. You use air wrenches or power tools to get things off. And you won't have as close and intimate contact with it, and therefore it won't run as well. Okay, take this off. There should be washers underneath them, and of course in this case there's not. Thanks to the guy who was there before. Whack the manifold a little bit. Pull it off and see if they used the right gasket. And amazingly enough, they did. You'd be surprised at how many people put in a small diameter gasket, or occasionally 2 gaskets, or all 3 gaskets in the gasket kit here. Should use a gasket that covers the manifold right and covers the head right. And if the manifold and head does not match, you got either a mismatched manifold or head. It's better to port the head of the manifold to really match everything, using the gasket as a template. We'll get into that a little later when we talk about that sort of thing. Put this in the to be kept box. Put the nuts in the to be stripped box. And now our head is basically ready to come off here once we take the necessary fasteners and rocker crane out. Pop the valve cover off. Note that this is the ball type, which Supers had, and it's the correct one for the engine. Note also But this is a super rocker train. It's got an aluminum stand, and all the rockers are held in by funny shaped saddle washers with nuts. The normal type engine rocker train is a cast iron stand, not aluminum, and the rocker shafts are held in by circlips. So you can always tell a super from a normal just by seeing what type of tie downs the rockers have. This is what it should have. It should have this type of tie down for a super. The way to get this off, in fact, we want to take them all off because we're going to disassemble the rockers, polish the shaft, and make sure there's no defects in either the rocker end here where it touches the valve, it can pit, or the rocker shaft itself, because when it rotates, if you get dirt inside, you can score the shaft. So the first thing to do is to go through and loosen all the valve adjustment nuts, because you're going to have to readjust the valves, and then when you put it together, and it's a good idea to take these things out to clean the rockers anyhow. And there's no better time to loosen these things than when they're all tied down to the rocker stand. So loosen them a few turns so you can get them off later. And then go through either with a socket or a wrench and loosen all of these, or take them all off. And now is the time. If you want to, you can mark your valve cover, even though the valve cover should be plated. You can use a container or a Ziploc bag. In fact, if you're nervous about which nuts and bolts came off of which part of the engine, use Ziploc bags or plastic bags or something and label them with what parts they are inside. Put the saddle washer in there. Check the rocker here where it contacts the valve, and this one is nice and smooth, no pits. That's good because these are getting hard to find in good shape. Put that inside. Go to the next set of nuts. Helps a little bit too if you break them all loose first and then loosen them evenly, especially when a valve spring is compressed. That tends to minimize the stress on everything as you undo them. So give them about a turn or so in the off direction as you go from one to the other. Okay. This is the intake rocker stand. It's held on by 3 studs and nuts. Normals with a cast iron stand only have 2 supports, and that's why they changed the supers, which are actually better. Being the super is better than normal anyhow. Take off everything now. Loosen them evenly here until the valve spring is no longer compressed, and you can take them off like yay. Now the intake rockers have a slightly different ratio than the exhaust rockers do, so they tend to pit the most. So once you get the intake rocker shaft off, look and see if they're pitted. And over here, we do see a little bit of pitting. It's not bad enough to warrant replacement of the rocker. We can take a file and either hand file it, it takes about 10 minutes to do, to where it's all nice and smooth again and the pits are gone. We'll take this rocker shaft apart and make sure it's okay. And now we take off the last rocker, which is the number 4 exhaust rocker. It's not, the valve spring is not under compression, so we can just take it off pretty easily. Take it off and check out this rocker contact area, and it's smooth and fine and no pits. Pull out the push rods. Look for anything strange in the push rods, like bent push rods. Now here we have something interesting. It looks like one push rod's rubbing against. The push rod tube itself has little convolutions in it. And it looks like it may have been rubbing against part of them. You can check that out a little later. The factory actually says about this vintage that when tolerances sum unfavorably, this can actually rub. So put them carefully in the rocker cover for the time being. You can also take, you can take off the bail. It's called a bail. It holds the rocker cover on. If you get one loose, you can usually wiggle the other one back and forth enough to where it comes off and stick that in the to-be plated box. Now, to get off the super rocker stand, there's 3 bolts. Tie it down, and they're 15 millimeter across the flat. So you get out your 15 millimeter across the flat socket, put it on yay, and they're torqued to 29 foot-pounds. They can be kind of tight. Again, it helps to break them all loose once before you take them off. Like yay. Now you don't have to plate these, nobody sees them, but I like to plate them anyhow. Makes them look a little nicer and gives you more of a feeling of accomplishment. Like yay. Pull on the rocker shaft and it'll come off. Not too much here, except they sometimes crack through here when people leave out head nut washers and torque the stand down, tends to bend it, and sometimes they crack. Sometimes the studs pull out, but much more often they pull out of magnesium stands, which are the early Super 90s, not the aluminum stands of the later Super, or Super 90 or 912. I'll put that in the rocker box. And now we're down to the bare head. And to remove the bare head, all you have to have is a 8mm Allen head wrench, which will fit in here very nicely and remove the head. This baby here, 10mm Allen head, got 8mm on the brain. Easily available from Sears or Snap-on for about $5 or $6. Now the trick here is to break them loose in basically the torquing order before you take them off. That does help to prevent any head warpage on removal, but I really don't think it makes a lot of difference, but it might make some. And it feels good psychologically to do it, so you may as well do it that way. Occasionally you'll hear the head releasing from the stress of being torqued, and if it releases slowly, it feels better. Once everything is unloosened, untorqued a bit, you can then take out the appropriate nuts. I usually go down here and take out the big ones first. I call these head bolts, but really they're head nuts because they fit on studs. Oh, there we go, as opposed to bolts, which of course, still loosening a little bit from 20 years of, well, 10 years not being uncorked. These should be plated. I like to plate them. Of course, you don't see them really, but I think it looks nicer. Makes for a more complete job when you plate them. Next time somebody takes it apart, you'll be impressed by, my God, I even plated the head nuts. Get them all off. Now there should be washers underneath each one, which you can't get off at this point. But when you take the head off, that's the time to take them off. So tap with your hand the head a little bit. Wiggle, tap, wiggle, tap. Wiggle, tap, and sometimes they'll come off with no problem. Now that's your air deflector there with a spring on the push rod. You want to save that, and I like to plate them. Note that the washers at this point will fall off on the ground if you're not careful like I wasn't. Take off the spring carefully and plate it too. These push rod tubes should always be replaced. You might want to keep a few around for spares, but don't keep too many. You tap the head slightly on something to get out the remaining washers. Try and keep them all together. Your dealer should have some, but if you don't live in California, you might not find them. And now you can inspect the cylinder head. There's a couple areas to inspect. One is the sealing area here, where the top of the cylinder seals on the inside of the head. And what you're looking for is any area of black that indicates a leak. And actually, believe it or not, except for one little area here, right about there, they look pretty good. In fact, they look like they're not leaking, which is wonderful if they're not leaking for two reasons. One, if they're not leaking, you don't have to fly cut the head. And two, if they're not leaking, you don't get carbon monoxide inside the engine, inside the car, from the engine, to kill you. The other area is to check for a crack between the spark plug hole and the intake valve, which usually occurs. Now they have to really be clean. The heads have to be cleaned up for that. And we really can't tell from here, but really bad cracks do stand out. I don't see any here. See the condition of the valves. They're crudted up, of course. You really can't tell if they're good or not until you take them apart, clean them up, and measure the stem of the valve. If the valve is worn more than 1 thou or so, I'd replace it. On these, I replaced the exhaust valves on general principles anyhow, and the intakes are so cheap you may as well replace them too. But we'll take this head to the machine shop and have the machinist check it out and make sure it's okay, but I think it's going to be a good head. So that goes in your box to be taken to the machine shop. Now the cylinders, at this point, you also check the outer perimeter of the cylinder to see if it's been leaking. The rather thick walls here, almost a 1/4 inch thick, infer this is a original cylinder, not a big bore kit. Big bore kit because the bore of the cylinder is 86 millimeter rather than 82.5. The wall of the cylinder, the bore of the piston is 86 millimeter rather than 82.5. The wall of the cylinder is necessarily thinner on the big bore kit. This is a stock set with very thick cylinder walls, and from the dome on the piston they sure look like supers. So if you want to, you can take off the cylinder, and lo and behold, we find the piston's in actually very good shape. In fact, if I had a guess, I'd say these things were just replaced relatively recently. Very nice shape. I'm very surprised. Usually you find them all crudded up with cylinder bypass, piston bypass past the rings. But these are actually amazingly clean. Almost like somebody's cleaned them off beforehand. Though we didn't do that. This is truly the first time I've ever taken this engine apart. Excellent shape. I'm very impressed. Since I do like the big bore kit, however, though, we will replace these with the big bore kit to show you what's going on. And now you can look down inside the case and see if there's anything weird down inside. But I don't see anything much weird here. You really can't tell too much till you take it apart. But now I'll go and take the other side off. If you want to stick around for that, fine. If not, I think it's time to take a break. Okay, now we're going to do the other side, take it off, and if you recall, there's this one screw here that would not come off for love nor money, so we have the weapon to use in this case, which is an impact wrench. This particular one is made from Sears, and you stick the appropriate sized screwdriver attachment into the screw of the flat of the screw. Take a decent sized hammer, in this case a 3-pound sledge, twist in the position you want it to come off in, and that's of course counterclockwise, and whack it. A few good ones while you're twisting. And if you're lucky, it will actually start to turn, which it is doing. It sometimes takes a few turns to get it to where it's loose enough so a screwdriver can get it off. We'll make sure this thing is loose enough. Let's try a screwdriver on it now. And how about that, sports fans? It actually is loose enough to come out. This particular one is so munged up on top, well, you can just toss that up. We'll save the washer. Put that in a 2B plated box, stripped and plated. And now we can continue removing everything else here like we did on the other side. So we first checked the nut on the J-tube heater box, and lo and behold, it's a 13. It should be a 12, but it's 13. It's not too terribly tight. Loosen that one up, and now this is the fun one. Oh, and lo and behold, that's a 12. So we go get a good 12 millimeter box end wrench. It'll fit in there. Hopefully fit in there. Lo and behold, it does. And we'll take this one all the way off and then come back and take the top one all the way off. Of course, you can't possibly get a socket in here, so you have to use wrenches in some cases. And good luck with an air wrench on this one. Note the condition of the heater box here. It's all rusty, dirty, covered with undercoating, etc. When it comes back from the strippers, it'll be like new metal. You might also want to inspect your oil cooler fins here. This is the rat's nest and crud from where the fan slings everything around. Usually when you take these off, you'll find this half of the cooler blocked completely by oil and crud and dirt and grease. If you have an engine leak almost anywhere in the engine, the fan will tend to suck that oil up and land it on the cooler, whereby it acts like an oil bath air filter and collects dirt from the air that comes in. There's a lot of air that comes in, a lot of cooling air, and will completely coat one half of the cooler, cutting down your cooling capacity by a factor of 2, making the engine run hot. 13 millimeter, the turkey before us put 13 and 12 millimeter nuts on everything. The wrong nuts. Take this off, put the nut in the to be stripped and plated, bring it back a little bit, lower it down, and lo and behold, the double flapper heater box comes off. Take off your muffler clamp. That gets plated while the box gets painted, and put that in the to be stripped and painted box. Now we got everything loose, we can just pull up all the sheet metal here, including the dipstick shroud, don't forget that. And put that in the to be stripped and painted box. And now we have back to removing the spark plugs again. So we get out our spark plug wrench, like yay. Remove these spark plugs and see what kind of shape this carburetor is in. And we see it's running somewhat rich, but really not bad considering. Considering the amazing conditions of the pistons on the other side, this side here would probably be as good. Generally, you'll find all kinds of blow-by marks on the piston from where the piston rings have lost their ability to seal too well, and they end up with combustion gases blowing by. And you need a new set of pistons and or rings. Now let's see what these nuts are. Crash bang. They're 13 millimeter there, so we'll loosen them up. And it'll be 14 on the other bolts, so we again know that the man before us, or the rebuilder before us, whoever he might have been, used the wrong types of nuts and bolts on things. Oop, 15. We don't want a 15. We want a 14, baby. Lo and behold, it is 14. And when this comes off, the manifold will come off. And then we can take the rockers and head off. Put this in the to be kept box, the bolt and washer to be strip box. And now we can proceed to take this side off. Take the rocker box area off, cover off. Again, go around and loosen everything. Actually, what you should first loosen is the rocker adjusting screws here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure they're loose. And they are. In fact, you can replace these with VW rocker adjusting screws. They're the same and they're cheap. These are special nuts with a different thread than the rocker adjuster has, so don't get these two nuts confused. They're very similar. They look almost identical, but they are different between the adjusting screw nut and the rocker tie-down nut. So now go through and loosen all of these, and then you can check and see if there are any valve springs that are compressed. In this case, we don't have any on this side that are compressed. We're lucky. So you can just go ahead now and take all these nuts off and take all the rockers off, because we have to disassemble them, check the shafts, polish the shafts, clean everything, and put everything back together again. Look at the end of the rocker where they touch the valve, and you can see that in fact that's in pretty good shape. And it's not pitted. We have a winner. Take the rocker stand off, intake rockers off. Here. Put everything in the rocker box for the time being. Okay, now look at this. Here's one that is pitted. Intake rocker that does have some pits in it. A little worse than the other side, but we can salvage this rocker. If this were really badly pitted, we would have no choice to either get another rocker, either new or used or in good shape, or to have this hard chrome, hard welded, and then reground back to stock, which is a hard thing to do and not many machine shops can do it. So I'd recommend highly, if you had a rocker that can't be saved, you get another used or new rocker rather than try to save the old one. But this one here can be saved by filing it down carefully. Don't use a grinder. If you use a grinder, you'll end up with taking too much material off or overheating it. Use a hand file and dress it. It doesn't take that much effort. It takes about 10-15 minutes to do. And you can save your rocker that way. Okay, let's take this exhaust rocker off. Look at it, and it looks fine too. That's not too bad. We only have 2 rockers out of 8 that are even moderately bad, even those aren't too bad. So this engine looks like really a rather low mileage engine, perhaps only as low as 100,000 miles, which in a 356 or 912 is indeed a low mileage engine. And now let us take the rocker stand off, which we do with a 15mm socket. Loosen all 3 bolts. We'll tie down the rocker stand to the head, like yay, and then withdraw them. And like I say, you don't have to plate them, but I find it nicer to do so. Be careful when you take the last one off, because then the rocker stand is free to fall. And you don't really want to break it, though they aren't too hard to find, swap meets and things. Okay. Throw. Put that in the rocker box. Now is a good time to attempt to take the bail off. However, with the give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I can move the world or take off a rocker cover bail. Wiggle and, well, we'll do it a little more effectively here using the lever technique. There. Get stripped and plated. And now we're down to the bare head. All I have to do is remove the 8 head nuts, and we will have this head off too. So for that, we get out our special 10mm Allen, dig up the wrench, socket wrench that we dropped. Remember now, loosen all 8 of these things first. It is psychologically more fulfilling to do it that way than to just go ahead and take them all off. And that does tend to prevent head warpage. Such a nice sound, relaxation. Okay, take them off, take the head nuts out. I then go down here and take these 4 out. Three, 4. Put them in the to-be plated box. Back up top side and take the remainder of the head nuts out. Okay. Get your wrench down, give the head a love tap, wiggle and pull. Note that the air deflector on this side is a little different than the air deflector on the other side. It's got a cutout for the acorn nut, because one of the acorn nuts from the case is what this has to go over, so that's why the cutout is different here than the little rectangular cutout on the other side is the bolt head of the case through bolt. Put this in the to be stripped and plated box. Carefully take off the spring that goes over the pushrod tube to hold that air deflector, and likewise put that in the to be plated box. Take out the pushrod tube. Note, these pushrod tubes do not have a 1-inch extension on them. That's because these are original pushrod tubes. Later pushrod tubes have a 1-inch extension here that sticks in the case to make it more difficult for oil to go up through the pushrod tube in hard cornering. But these are original pushrod tubes. We're going to replace these anyhow. So these can be tossed. Save a couple for in case one of the replacement one leaks or something, but you may not have a problem anyhow. Pull off the cylinder. And now here we have a side with a little bit more blow-by, but these pistons are still amazingly good considering. Most of the time, you'll see a lot of blow-by, especially by the wrist pin area. It'll be all black in this area here, where from leakage of combustion products past the rings discolor the piston. Likewise, in about half to 3/4 of the engines, the top compression ring will be broken in many pieces. In this case, both of these, all 3 of the top compression rings are fine. Likewise, the oil control. I guess the previous overhauler must have put a new set of pistons and rings in here, because this has obviously been run for some time. but there are no broken rings. Now we're going to take the pistons out. There are snap rings inside here of two types. One type requires a pair of pliers, which is this type here. The other type requires a completely circular one without any clips to be grabbed by pliers, and they require you pry it out with a very small screwdriver or awl. In this case, a specially machined screwdriver can be used to get out those other type of rings, retaining rings for the wrist pin. So in this case, we can use a pair of pliers. The thing you should do is get the piston out as far as it'll go, get in there with a pair of pliers, compress it, and pull out the retaining ring. Put that somewhere where you won't forget it. Go over to the other side like so, get it in there, and pull it out. Now you'll note that these pistons come out, this side comes out and that side comes out, and likewise these are both in. So you should go over the other side and get out the retaining keepers for the wrist pin while you're thinking of it. And then you take both pistons off on opposite sides of the engine. It'll minimize the amount of turning over of the engine you have to do. And it saves the pistons going back and forth inside the case and breaking off or something. Breaking off the rings or the oil control rings or the screw to the piston. I got both of these. Now a special little homemade tool for taking out the wrist pin can be as simple as an expendable socket extension, about 2-inch extension, with a either 9, 10, or 11 millimeter socket. This will fit inside the wrist pin like yay, and the shoulder of the socket fit up against the end of the wrist pin. And you take a moderate hammer, like our favorite 3-pound sledge, support the piston like so, and give it a few little love taps. And if you get it out far enough so it clears everything, if you get it out far enough so it clears everything, you can then slide the piston out. Now this piston obviously has been replaced at some recent time in the past. It's nice and clean inside. Most of the time when you see this, there'll be all kinds of crud inside here. There'll be crud on the outside of the piston all over. This engine was torn down and pistons put in it very recently. Probably sat around for 10 years after that, but it wasn't too long ago that that was done. While you're here, you can check the connecting rod for any being too tight or too loose or something. And you look down inside the case, you can see things like what type of cam follower it has, etc. But you don't have to do that. We'll take it all apart and show you then. Likewise, having gotten one piston out, you go to the other side and get the other piston out. Same technique. Now it helps to support the piston with your hand when you're doing this, or you can bend the connecting rod. And sometimes neither amount of pounding will work, and you have to use heat. Either a torch or even a light bulb set on top. That's Dick Pike's favorite technique, is a light bulb set on top of the piston will heat the piston up enough to where the hole gets bigger and the wrist pin will then come out. These pistons can be reused. We'll put the big bore kit on to show you how that works though, and save these pistons for some other mild engine. We're going to make this engine into one that has a little more power than your average engine. Okay, so then you crank the engine over 180 degrees until these other two pistons come out. Stick their nose out as far as they'll go. Get your pair of pliers in there. Remove the wrist pin clips on both sides. Okay. Go over to this side and do the same thing. Be careful when you do that, because if you let that wrist pin go and it flies up into your eye, you can be called Patch or One Eye. You get a nickname like that, it's not much fun. So either wear safety glasses or be very careful when you're removing these wrist pin retainers because of just what you saw happen there. Get them all out. Get out your little favorite wrist pin remover. Pick the angle that you work at the best. try and support the piston. This way, if you miss and hit your hand, you'll know it. Get it out as far as it can go. Okay, don't hit the case. Once the wrist pin retainer starts to go, or wrist pin starts to go, it usually will go pretty smoothly. Okay, now I'll take the last one out. Oh yeah. Okay. Now we have all 4 pistons off. Next step is to split the lower end. And here's where the heavy-duty torque comes in. We have to remove both the flywheel nut after taking the pressure plate off and the pulley nut to do this. And this engine is still filled with oil. So your next best bet is at this point to drain the oil by dropping the screen and plate underneath the engine. And that's what we'll do now. If you want to go out and get a beer or something, now's the time to do that. Why don't you pause it for now? We're doing a lovely job of draining the oil, or kerosene or water, whatever happens to be inside this thing. As you can see, the oil is draining. In order to split the lower end of this case, split it in half, we have to take off the pan, the screen, and all the gaskets in between, because if anything is left on, it'll keep the case tabs from separating. So now you let the oil drain out, take the last screw out. It's supposed to be nuts, but occasionally the entire stud will come out. Take out the drain plate, like you note the magnet. See how much crud is on the magnet. In this case, we have some evidence of ring wear from the hair on the magnet. Incidentally, after you do an overhaul, you should drain the oil by dropping this plate at 50 miles, 300 miles, and 1,000 miles. In fact, the first time you should drain it between about 10 and 30 miles. That gets out any crud that's left inside the engine, as well as any original wear particles that may form. Take out the gasket, throw it away, take out the screen. Now check the screen for what's on it. It tells you a lot about the engine. In this case, we have some crud, but we have neither bronze particle crud or aluminum colored crud, which infer a bearing or part of the case is going. In fact, we just have the usual sludge from not having had the oil drain plate dropped in probably 10 or 15,000 miles. But everything appears to be okay. You can reach your finger up inside here, disgusting as it may seem, pretend you're a proctologist, and check out for any particles inside. And besides sludge, we seem to have basically nothing. At this point, it's a wise move to rotate the case a bit, take out the stop, prevents from doing, rotate from side to side, so that any remaining oil comes out. There will always be some remaining oil, no matter how well you do this. And whenever you split the case, there will be some oil come out of the case, both the third piece and the main case halves. So it helps to have the engine on a drain plate or pan, so the oil goes on the plate or pan, not on the floor of your nicely painted garage, or living room, bedroom, whatever, kitchen floor, whatever. Okay, so you keep rotating to get as much of this crud out as possible. And now we're ready to take the flywheel off and the pulley end off. And this is where all the fun begins, because the flywheel nut's torqued to between 260 and 350 foot-pounds, depending upon which book you read. I torqued the good flywheel nuts, of which the Maestro has a very good supply, to 425 foot-pounds. I've never had a flywheel nut come loose that was torqued anywhere near those specs. So our next step is to take off the pressure plate. And this is a factory engine stand head with 4-bar support and a machine recess here for a flywheel lock. And that keeps the flywheel from turning, which you don't want it to do when you're taking off either the pressure plate or the flywheel nut. So we'll put the flywheel lock in place and torque it down once we wipe our hands. Let me go off camera here for a second. If you don't like getting dirty or don't want to, I suggest you have somebody else do your engine overhaul, because there ain't no way of doing it without getting dirty. Get your favorite 13mm wrench for this particular engine Now normally you can't get the box end on, so you're left with the open end, which usually will work. Usually will work. Like so. On the pressure plate bolts, it is much better to loosen them one at a time and go around. Oh boy. Go around in sequence. That is to take them all off at once. That, especially if you want to keep the pressure plate and reuse it again. You can tell what condition the pressure plate's in by how much wear there is on the fingers of the pressure plate where the throwout bearing has touched it. If there's a lot of wear here, like more than 1/3 or so of the fingers worn away, you're best off replacing it. If there's not a lot of wear, you can reuse it as long as the other surface that mates against the clutch disc is okay. We won't know that until we actually take this off, which with a little bit of luck we should be able to have off in a few minutes here. There we go. Okay, having loosened all 6 pressure plate nuts, bolts, what we should do is turn them about half a turn to a turn at a time, loosening them all up evenly so the pressure plate relaxes evenly and you don't end up with the fingers on one side being tight and the fingers on the other side being loose. This will save your pressure plate in case it is still usable. Takes a little longer to do it this way, but those things, to do it right, usually does take longer anyhow. I also notice on this pressure plate that there's some weld material here. It appears to be weld material. It's one of the techniques of balancing a pressure plate whereby to balance the pressure plate, you either have to remove mass or add mass. The mass can be added by welding it on or removed by drilling it off. And generally, I think it's better to remove it by drilling mass off than to weld it on, because the heat of the welding torch will usually distort the metal enough to maybe reduce some of the temper of the diaphragm spring or otherwise make things weak and consequently not work too well. So drilled holes are stress risers, but these things are on the side of the pressure plate. The outer circumference is not under much stress, so it's really not a problem to drill holes to balance it. Also, these little holes here in the pressure plate and the flywheel are for dowel pins. Those dowel pins are used to center the pressure plate on the flywheel so that when you put the pressure plate back on the flywheel after it's been balanced, it A, only goes on one way, and B, goes on with a tolerance of like 1/10,000th of an inch or less, which means it's not off. If it's off, all your balancing is for naught. So really, though this might have been balanced, because there are no dowels there, it really wasn't balanced. The pressure plate can wiggle on the bolts enough to make it out of balance, and therefore not balanced. So if you do balance anything, like the pressure plate and the flywheel, you should pin the pressure plate to the flywheel so it always goes on A, the same way, and B, within tight tolerances, so that the balanced flywheel pressure plate combination remains balanced. Now, this is a 180 millimeter pressure plate and clutch disc necessarily. All the normals and supers of the 1950 to 1963 vintage have a 180 millimeter pressure plate. Super 90s from 60 to 63 and all the 356Cs and SCs had 200 millimeter pressure plates, which are a lot better. And you can put a 200 millimeter clutch into a 356A or B if you know how to do it, as described in the book, The ABCs and 912s of Porsche Engines, or in Secrets of the Inner Circle. But you do have to use a 200 millimeter flywheel, as well as a 200 millimeter clutch and pressure plate, to get a 200 millimeter clutch. This is a 180 millimeter flywheel. They're readily available and fairly cheap. The 200 millimeter flywheels everybody wants, and they're expensive. We do have some new 200 millimeter Cs and Super 90 flywheels in stock, but they're getting down to where we pretty much can only put them on engines we're building, simply because there aren't too many of them anymore. These are brand new. There are a few used ones floating around too, but used ones usually have wear on the ring gear teeth, which you should inspect the ring gear here for starter gears wear problems, whether the teeth are worn too much from starter gears turning the engine over for 100,000 miles or more. Check that out, of course. You can also see how many times it's been surfaced by the thickness of these gear teeth, because each time you surface the outside surface of the flywheel, these gear teeth get smaller. We almost got the pressure plate off. We can inspect both the pressure plate, disc, and flywheel surface and see what kind of shape everything is in. It's possible, if everything is okay, to reuse this pressure plate, though I'm generally in favor of replacing pressure plates because, one, they're not too expensive to do, and two, you of course have to pull the engine to do it again in case you don't do it now. And likewise, if you pull the engine to replace the pressure plate and replace the pressure plate, you should rebalance it, which means taking the flywheel off, which is not that much fun, and you may not want to do it unless you have to. So now is the time to do anything like that, and I would recommend it be done. Okay, pressure plate's off. There are some score marks on it, but it's not bad. It's fairly smooth, doesn't show too many burn marks. It's actually still usable. Now here's something, though, you should note. Two things. One, this disc is not a Porsche disc. It's a VW disc. The way you can tell that is no internal springs here that the Porsche disc has to help take the shock of clutch engagement. The solid center here, it's a VW disc. It works, but it doesn't work as well as a Porsche. So this becomes garbage. Put that in the garbage container. This pressure plate also at one point had a real Porsche disc in it. And apparently it was either machined here beforehand or the pressure plate itself machined it. You see these marks made here. I found some of these pressure plates, 180s, will interfere with the disc here on the inside and machine this area here as you see it. Machined by the disc usually. I don't think that was machined on purpose by somebody else. So they probably had a dragging clutch problem before, replaced the Porsche disc with a VW disc to cure that problem, but we can fix this problem by machining this area out so there is no interference. That's the pressure plate. Look at the flywheel surface, feel it, it's smooth, look at it. There seem to be no check patterns indicating it's burnt. Got a few ridges in it. A simple surface job might suffice on this. And we'll show you how the flywheels are surfaced anyhow. It really should be surfaced, I think. If we're really scratched and gored, it's no question it should be surfaced. This is actually usable as it is, but it's a little off and we're doing an overhaul we want to have done right. So we'll surface the flywheel. Now the fun really begins. We got the flywheel off. So we will torque down the locking fingers here so the flywheel can't move. And now the fun will really begin because we're going to remove the flywheel and the pulley. To do that, we have to break loose the flywheel nut, which is torqued anywhere from 250 to 500, in some cases 1,000 foot-pounds. So to do that, we have to have a proper type of device and tool. So allow me to move. Okay, now to remove the flywheel nut, you need a 36mm socket, a breaker bar, and you'll find out if you have a breaker bar like this, you won't be able to budge it. Like yay. In fact, what you have to do in that case then is call one of your neighborhood girls. There's one there. Come on over here, neighborhood girl.
Why, I just thought I'd drop in.
And you need to have her stand on the stand here, because otherwise the whole engine stand can flip over unless it's tied down to the ground. So now, if you assume the position.
Just like we've done before.
More than once. And you get out an extension for your breaker bar. You put over the breaker bar like this, see? And then you get on the end of that extension and you lift yourself up, and lo and behold, the flywheel nut breaks loose just like that. You turn it a few turns to make sure it's nice and loose. And then we can go tackle the pulley nut. You may step down now, dear.
Is it over already?
It's over already.
Oh. May I leave now?
We'll just go off stage for a second. We may need you again for a second time. Now we turn the thing around because we have to do the opposite side. Pulley nut turns the other way. Put the drain pan underneath it. Get out the pulley wrench. which incidentally is a 30mm socket. Put the pulley wrench on and see if we can break it loose without tipping the engine stand over. And we can't do it. So you call your neighborhood girl again, neighborhood girl.
Oh, I need it again. Where do I go?
Same place. We can move it around for you here. It always helps to have a local computer teenage girl around to help you when you need it. And now, like so. No, I just broke it loose. There's such help. Thank you, dear.
You're welcome.
Take a bow for the audience. The millions and millions of people out there that are watching your every moment.
Porsche engine saved.
Take off the pulley nut. Toss it in the to-be plated box. If you're really lucky, the pulley will come off. Again, if you're really lucky, check right in here for where the keyway notch is made. See if there's any cracks from there to the outer rim of the seal. The sealing surface, a seal here. Pulley seal actually seals on the pulley here. See if there are any cracks there. There aren't. Carefully place it in the pulley box. Don't throw it. It can break, and if it breaks, they're expensive. Next step, there's a little key there. You got to take the key off, so you take a screwdriver and very carefully tap it like yay. Wiggle it around and save this key. Put it someplace where it won't get lost. And remember where you put it. You have to take that key off in order to get the third piece off. At this point, we're getting down to the short strokes now, as they say. The pulley shroud is held in place by two 6mm bolts. These are special bolts. They're not as long as the other bolts that hold other parts of the engine together, like the sheet metal. They're actually very short. They're supposed to be very short. In this case, they aren't. They're very long because the guy before us put the wrong screws in. The reason why they're short is to not go in. If they go in too far, they'll bottom out and strip the aluminum here and make life hell for you trying to put in new screws and you go to reassemble it. So you take the other one out and the pulley shroud then becomes free. Again, the wrong screw. These should be very short screws, less than 6mm long. Put that in the to-be strip box. At this point, you can also, with a 10mm wrench, loosen all the nuts on the oil pump cover. Since you have to do that anyhow eventually when you take it apart, you may as well do it now. Like so. In fact, if you want to, you can take them off. It doesn't hurt. Just takes an added second, and it's easier to do it here. Now, this particular bolt on the lower left-hand corner of the late model pump is a special one. It's almost 2 inches long, and no other bolts like it in the engine. And if you lose it, good luck. So put that in the same place you put that pulley key, and proceed to take the rest of them out. The rest of the nuts on the oil pump cover, like yay. You should leave your generator stand on because to take the third piece off, it's easier to hit the stand with a hammer and better for the third piece than to hit the third piece with a hammer. The generator stand is fairly tough and not susceptible to doing anything bad when you hit it, but the third piece can crack if you hit it too hard. So take all the pulley nuts off like yay. Throw them in the to-be stripped and plated box. And now we're ready to take off the third piece. Now, like I said, these nuts here should be 12mm across the flat, but it's because some turkey was here before us, they've been changed to 13. So get out a 13mm wrench or socket and take all these babies off. There's 11 of these nuts on the third piece of a 356 case, and there's 7 on a 912 with 4 funny-looking nuts that are for the 912 rear mount. So take them all off. Okay. Takes a few minutes to do this, but it doesn't take too long. If you want to, you can go out and get a beer. This is pretty boring. But it's something you have to do if you want to remove the third piece. You can also, if you want to, take off the dowel pin bolt that holds the number 4 main bearing in place. That's a good time to do it right now. And take off the clamp for the generator. I'm sorry, take off the clamp for the distributor. here. That gets plated also. To return from getting your beer, we've taken off the remainder of the nuts on the third piece. You grab a nice rubber hammer and tap lightly on the back of the generator stand, and lo and behold, the third piece comes off. Note that so does the oil too in the third piece, so have something under the engine when you take off the third piece to catch the oil that comes out. There's always some. Keep tapping until you can remove it with your hand. Now we get to check a few things here of great import. In fact, here we have something that was very important. This is the oil pump drive gear that drives the oil pump. It's driven by the cam. If you note here, if you can see this on close-up, in fact, it's almost worn around in a complete circle. There's not much left of the tank. Now, occasionally, these things do wear all the way around. The oil pump stops being driven by the camshaft. You lose your oil pump and you lose your oil pressure, and you end up with a blown engine if you don't stop the engine in about 1 minute or so. This one is going to have to be replaced, this oil pump drive. In fact, the cam shows pretty severe wear of it too, so either it'll have to be welded or replaced. And we'll probably replace it with another camshaft. Okay, at this point you can take out the distributor drive and the washer. Don't lose that washer. It's very important. Take it out and put it in the same place you put the keyway key from the pulley and a special long bolt from the oil pump. In this case, the gasket is still intact, amazingly enough. So we can take it off. We can inspect what else has been done here, and we see that we have these brown seals. They're the wrong ones. These seals are for a 912 isolated mount cooler, and they're being used here for the oil passageways. They work, but they're actually the wrong ones. It could pinch the oil passageway too much. It didn't do it in this case. This is your bypass line that takes oil pressure from behind the number 3 main bearing and feeds it to below your oil pressure bypass valve. And that's to allow oil to go to the cooler. So you take it off, and you can either plate this, strip it and plate it, or just clean it up and use it again. I like to strip it and plate it. We'll set this aside for the time being. And now we go to the finishing off the rest of the case. At this point, it's nice to take a 19mm wrench box and loosen but not remove the oil temperature sender. And likewise, a 14mm wrench can be used to loosen and remove the oil line to the oil filter. Let's we have a 14mm here, like yay. And a 17mm open end can be used here. Earlier ones had a 14mm, but everything post 1961.5 has 17mm. Take off everything, save all the washers in case you may need them later, and put this in the same place as all the other important pieces we just discussed, like so. Now we may as well take this off too. This is the oil return line from the filter. 12mm wrench takes it off. Unscrew it. This is an ugly line. You can toss it or keep it for a spare. We'll put a new one on. At this point now, we're left with only a few more fasteners. We can split the case. Good time to take off the oil cooler. You have good access to it. These early coolers are 10mm across the flat. So a 10mm wrench will take it off. And we have a 10mm wrench here. Loosen them. Sometimes you'll be surprised that you'll find these coolers have one or more broken studs. And the broken studs, even though there's one or two, occasionally two of these studs are broken, the coolers won't leak. It's pretty incredible, but it happens a lot. Another reason why I don't like these coolers is because the 6mm studs they have do tend to break. And believe me, on your engine, when they break, they'll leak. But on other engines I've seen that they don't leak. The late model coolers have 8mm studs, not 6. And they are a much heavier duty cooler. In fact, they're so heavy duty, the cases usually break before the coolers do, which actually is worse. I'm going to show you a little trick here in a second when we get this cooler off. This cooler, incidentally, if it's not leaking and there's no evidence that it was, could be reused. You clean it out in nice benign solvent and then clean it and dry it, and it can be reused then. I'm going to replace this and show how that's done with a late style cooler, one that you can get a little more cooling capacity out of and therefore allow your engine to run a little bit cooler than it would with this early style cooler. Take off all 3 6mm nuts, which are 10mm across the flat. And after you get that one off, like yay, this will come up. Again, you use the wrong washers, seals here, either again from a 912, but that doesn't matter now. Now I'm going to show you a neat little trick on how to get this bolt out here to plate it. You must remove the fitting for the oil return from the oil filter. If you try to remove it like yay, you'll find that it sometimes works like it did. But if it didn't work, what you can do is go get your return line, put on your 11mm wrench, put the return line back on again. That will imprison the wrench on top of the fitting, and then you can turn and break it loose without rounding off the nuts. Now in this case, the fitting came out easily, but in many cases that fitting is really hard to get out, and you'll have no choice but to use that technique I just showed you. Anyhow, you take the fitting out, and now we can get out all 8, 4 on the top and 4 on the bottom, perimeter bolts. We'll take off the 6 acorn nuts, and we'll take off the 2 nuts that are on opposite the cam plug, which means you have to take the flywheel off, which is why we broke it loose. And then we can split the case. So, bear with me now. We will find the 14mm wrench and a 14mm socket all set up here. Excuse me while I cross. Break them loose and take them off. Put them all on all the nuts, bolts, and washers in your to be plated box. Oh boy. Sometimes they are tight, fans. There we go. We're in the final stages here, within about 5 minutes or so of splitting the case. We already know that the cam, that we should have done this because one, the cam is pretty well wiped from the wear of the oil pump drive, and two, the oil pump drive gear itself is pretty well wiped out and must be replaced. This engine probably only had about 10,000, 20,000 more miles to go before that oil pump drive would have worn completely around, leaving 0 oil pressure in the engine and necessitated a required overhaul. The wear gets exponential when it starts to wear a little, flops around more and more. The more it wears, the faster it wears, and very quickly you get exponential wear and failure of the part. So we were on that curve, exponential part of the curve. It wouldn't have lasted much longer. Now, we got the bottom ones out. Okay. Fooling around in the mud and the blood and the beer. Ah! While you're here, you can check out the cam, see if there's anything strange about the cam gear teeth, the crank gear drive teeth. I see nothing weird here except for the wear of the slot in the center of the cam where that oil pressure or oil pump gear wart. Other than that, it seems to be in fairly decent shape. Okay, one more to go. And we can then take all the bolts out, perimeter bolts. That'll leave just the 6 acorn nuts. And then we'll take them off, and we'll see what's inside this thing. I actually like doing original engines the best, or basket cases that are so mismatched as to be obscene. They're the biggest challenge. Original engines make for the best overhauls because they haven't been played with by any clod between the time they left the factory and now. It's of course getting very difficult to find original engines anymore, but they do exist. About 1 out of every 4 or 5 that I do is an original engine, and they really make the nicest overhauls. They of course do have some worn components. The pistons are junk, and the oil pump drives are junk, and the cams have to be ground or replaced. But the heads are usually uncracked. Now take the flywheel nut off and take a screwdriver and wiggle back and forth. Carefully, don't overdo it. Alternate, hold on the flywheel with one hand so you don't drop it or anything. And if you wiggle, it'll eventually come off. Check the dowel pin area for elongation dowel pins, elongated dowel pin holes in the crank or flywheel. These are fine. Check the seal area here for having a big score mark, which it doesn't. That's fine. Check the surface like we did before. Fairly smooth, but we'll surface it to show you how that's done. Take this to the machine shop, set it in a safe place. Now there's two nuts here, which you can't see. They're around the cam plug. In this case, they're 12 millimeter across the flat, which is nice because it's hard to get to. They're usually 14 on a 356 and 13 on a 912. But in this particular situation, the guy who put the engine back together again used 12 millimeter across the flat. So take them out. And then we have 6 case acorn nuts to go, and we can then split the case. Incidentally, if you do have difficulty finding parts, HCP Research has a goodly supply of them. In fact, usually more of a supply than any other supplier has. If you need any parts for a 356 or 912 engine, either for an overhaul or replacement parts or things that have failed, drop us a line, we'll see what we can do for you. We usually deliver. The acorn nuts are 15 millimeter across the flat, so a 15 millimeter wrench will take them off. Oh, they're tied to 29 foot-pounds unless somebody used red Loctite. I don't know what they used in this case, but they're pretty tight. This one is a through bolt. Oh, it's pretty loose. They didn't tighten that one down right. That one's about right. That one's a little bit loose. When we put it together again, I'll show you how you can torque these so this doesn't happen. That one's about right. And that one's pretty tight. So kind of all over the ballpark there. Okay, now you should get out a special wrench, screwdriver, and carefully remove these special bevel washers. These are special. They have an inside bevel here for the O-ring seal that fits over the stud to prevent leaks. Do not plate these. When you plate them, they crack. You can through bolt out. It has a washer on it on the other side. Take the washer off, save the washer, put it with the other ones, and then take the bolt itself and put it in to be plated. You don't have to, but it looks nicer. Now everything is off, the case is ready to split, so rotate the engine until it's like about yay. Get a piece of 2x4 or 2x6, place it like so, and with a nice sledgehammer or something, give it a couple of nice love taps. Like yay. Then go down underneath. Like so, and now you see there's a bit of a split beginning to occur here. Do it a few more times. Repeating from top to bottom. Tap the other one. Underneath here is a very poor one that'll work. Okay. A few more times. Ouch. Don't try and put a screwdriver. It's very tempting to put a screwdriver in here, but don't do it. Now sometimes if it does too much, you can attach it like yay and use momentum. You got to make sure everything is off, including all the gaskets here, all the bolts. Everything is off. Just a matter of time. beginning to split. Yep, beginning to split all right. We're getting there. One half of it is beginning to come. Slowly. Very slowly. There we go. Now, when it gets about a quarter-inch or so, you get off the alignment dowels, which is not quite. A little bit more and we'll have it. When it gets a little further away, it'll be time to decide which side of the case the crank is going in. Occasionally at this point, we can tip it again, and this should usually do it. And it's coming. I know so it's Christmas, but it's coming. There we go. Here's the wood. You won't damage it. If you hit on these flanges directly, you can break them off against the wood. Okay, when it gets to be about an inch apart, you gotta watch out, your camshaft can fall on the ground. Likewise, see the crank is coming in the right-hand case half, which is of course the wrong one, and you don't want to do that, but you get it a little bit further, and then usually reach in and take out the cam, carefully, rotating it so the lobes come out, and the cam won't fall on the ground. Not much good because the oil pump dry slot being worn, but the gear is good. Set that safely aside, grab the crank, keep pulling, don't mind that, it's a bearing half. Keep wiggling. And there isn't much left. There. Hurrah. Now, we're not done. There are several things we can inspect here. One, we take out the cam plug, put that in the to-be stripped and plated box. Here are the cam followers. We look at them, see if they have numbers. They do. 21411, that's out of a 62 Super. You can pull all 8 cam followers out and check it. They all hold the same number so far. We can take the crank out, the case, like yay. Take the bearing off, inspect it for crud. It's got some. Look at the crank, it looks pretty good. We have to measure it though, the micrometer to be sure, and magnaflux it. The rods are late model rods, 01 type rods. We can, they're very excellent rods, same as 912. We'll take the rods off the crank in a second. We grab a main bearing, one that fell out. We clean it off. We can sometimes see a number on it, which would be the size. But in this particular situation, I don't believe we can. So we'll have to clean the case and torque it together anyhow, and measure the bore, and see if it has to be a line board or not. Take off all the seals, old seals on the studs. Actually, you should have done that after you took the washers off. With an X-Acto knife, it's kind of hard to get in there, but you can do it. And we'll clean the case thoroughly, torque it together, measure the case bore, and see if we have to line bore it. If we do have to line bore it, HCP Research has a goodly supply of line bore bearings for 356As and Bs, those with 50mm crankshafts that are found no place else. All right, now I will show you in a second here how to take the crankshaft apart with only your old flywheel and the flywheel nut.